I still remember the way my daughter-in-law looked at me that night when she placed 8 crumpled dollars in my hand and said, "Stop being so dramatic." At 72 years old, I had buried my husband, raised a son, paid off a mortgage, and survived things most people never talk about. But nothing prepared me for the quiet moment when your own family decides you no longer belong in your own home. My name is Eleanor Whitmore, and 1 week before that moment I believed I was living the final chapter of a peaceful life. The house on Maple Ridge Drive had been ours for 38 years. My husband George built the wooden porch himself one summer when Jason was still a boy running barefoot through the sprinklers. The living room window faced the street, and every afternoon the sunlight came through in the same gentle way, warming the rug where George used to sit with his newspaper. After George passed away last spring, the house felt quieter, but I told myself that was normal. Grief leaves a hollow in the air, like a room where the furniture has been removed. Jason and his wife Brittany moved in not long after the funeral. Brittany said they wanted to help keep an eye on me, which sounded kind enough at the time. Jason was 43, a grown man with gray starting to touch his temples, but to me he still looked like the boy who once needed help tying his shoes before school. I believed letting them stay would keep the house alive again. At first things seemed normal. Brittany would make coffee in the mornings and Jason mowed the lawn on Saturdays. But little things began to change. The kitchen cabinets were reorganized without asking. The spare bedroom became Brittany's home office. My favorite chair in the living room was moved to the basement because, according to Brittany, it made the room look old. None of it seemed important enough to argue about. When you reach my age, you learn to choose peace whenever possible. Still, there was something in the way Brittany spoke to me sometimes that made the air feel colder. She had a habit of smiling while saying things that didn't feel like smiles at all. One evening at dinner she joked that I was lucky to have young people managing the house now. Jason laughed softly and kept eating, and I told myself not to take it personally. But the truth is, you notice when your place in your own life begins shrinking inch by inch. The night everything changed started quietly. It was a Tuesday in early October, cool enough that the wind carried the smell of fallen leaves through the screen door. I had just finished washing the dishes when Brittany walked into the kitchen holding her phone. Her face had that same polite smile she used when talking to customer service agents or strangers at the grocery store. Jason stood behind her near the doorway, his hands shoved into the pockets of his jeans like a man waiting for a bus. "Eleanor," Brittany said, "not Mom, never Mom, just Eleanor, we need to talk about the living arrangement." I dried my hands on a towel and sat at the kitchen table. The overhead light hummed softly above us. "What about it?" I asked. Brittany leaned against the counter like she had practiced this conversation in front of a mirror. "Jason and I have been discussing the future of the house," she said. "And we think it would be healthier for everyone if you found a different place to stay." For a moment I thought I had misunderstood her. My hearing is still perfectly fine, but sometimes the mind refuses to accept what the ears clearly heard. "Different place?" I repeated slowly. Jason looked down at the floor. The silence stretched longer than it should have. Brittany stepped forward and placed something on the table. A small stack of bills. I looked at it and counted without touching them. $5. 2 singles. And a crumpled one. $8. Brittany folded her arms. "You can stay at a motel for a few nights while you figure things out," she said calmly. "There's one near the highway." I waited for Jason to speak. I waited for him to say this was some kind of misunderstanding. But he didn't look at me. He just shifted his weight from one foot to the other like a man standing in the wrong line at the bank. I picked up the money and held it in my palm. It felt strangely light. "You want me to leave my own house tonight?" I asked. Brittany tilted her head slightly, almost amused by the question. "Oh, Eleanor," she said with a small sigh, "stop being so dramatic." Something inside me went very still at that moment. Not anger. Not even sadness. Just a quiet understanding that the life I thought I had was already gone. I stood up from the table, walked to the hallway closet, and took down my coat. Jason finally glanced up, but he didn't say a word. Outside, the night air was colder than I expected. The porch light flickered above the door George built all those years ago. I stepped off the porch with $8 in my hand and nowhere particular to go. Behind me, the front door closed with a soft click, the kind of sound that barely registers unless you know it means everything has just changed. The first place I went that night was the bus stop at the corner of Maple Ridge and Hawthorne Avenue, because when a person suddenly has nowhere to go, the mind reaches for familiar places like a hand searching for a light switch in the dark. I sat down on the cold metal bench and looked again at the $8 in my palm, as if the number might change if I stared at it long enough. A car passed slowly through the intersection and its headlights swept across the empty street before disappearing into the distance. It was a quiet neighborhood, the kind where people turned off their porch lights before 10 o'clock and locked their doors without thinking twice. I had lived there long enough to recognize the rhythm of the night, but sitting on that bench I felt like a stranger passing through a town that no longer belonged to me. I checked the small watch George had given me on our 25th anniversary. It was just after 9:30. I tried to remember the name of the motel Brittany mentioned, but nothing came to mind except the image of the highway sign several miles away that advertised weekly rates and free parking. $8 would not cover a night anywhere in America, but the thought of knocking on a stranger's door for help felt heavier than the cold wind brushing against my coat. So I did what many people my age have learned to do when life becomes confusing. I began walking. The sidewalks were uneven in places and scattered with dry leaves that crunched softly under my shoes. As I passed the elementary school Jason once attended, I remembered how he used to wave at me from the playground fence after class. He had been such a gentle child. Even now it was difficult to connect that memory with the silent man who stood behind Brittany in the kitchen doorway earlier that night. Parenthood does not come with instructions for moments like that. You raise someone with love and patience and hope that the goodness you place in their heart stays there long after they grow up. But people change in ways that are often quiet and slow. Sometimes the change is so gradual you do not see it until you are already standing outside your own front door with nowhere left to stand. After about 20 minutes of walking, I reached a small gas station that stayed open all night for truck drivers and travelers passing through town. The fluorescent lights above the pumps buzzed softly and the smell of coffee drifted out each time the glass door opened. I stepped inside and approached the counter where a young man in his 20s was scrolling through something on his phone. He looked up politely when he saw me. I asked if there was a motel nearby that might have a room available. He pointed toward the highway and mentioned a place called Riverside Lodge about 2 miles down the road. I thanked him and used $3 of my $8 to buy a cup of coffee and a plain bagel. It was not much of a dinner, but the warmth of the coffee steadied my hands in a way I did not expect. I sat at a small table near the window and watched the traffic lights blinking red outside. For the first time since leaving the house, I allowed myself to think about what had actually happened. Brittany's words replayed in my mind in the same calm tone she used earlier. Stop being so dramatic. The strange thing about cruelty is that it does not always arrive with shouting or anger. Sometimes it arrives wrapped in politeness and quiet smiles. When I finished the bagel, I placed the remaining $5 carefully into my coat pocket and began the long walk toward the highway. The night air grew colder as the road widened and the sound of passing trucks echoed across the empty fields. By the time the glowing sign for Riverside Lodge appeared ahead of me, my feet were aching and the wind had turned sharp enough to make my eyes water. The motel looked older than I expected, with faded blue paint and a small office window lit by a single lamp. I pushed open the door and stepped inside, where an older woman sat behind the front desk reading a paperback novel. She looked up and greeted me with a tired but friendly smile. I explained that I needed a room, but I did not mention the $8 or the kitchen conversation or the quiet click of the door closing behind me. Some stories are easier to carry when they remain unspoken. She told me the nightly rate and I knew immediately that I could not afford it. I thanked her anyway and turned to leave when she called after me and asked if everything was all right. I paused for a moment and then simply said that I had experienced an unexpected evening. She studied my face carefully in the way older people often do when they recognize something familiar in another person's expression. Without asking any more questions, she offered a small room at the end of the building that was sometimes used by travelers who needed a place to rest before continuing their journey in the morning. The price she mentioned was far less than I expected and close enough to what I could manage if I was careful. I nodded quietly and handed her the $5 I still had. She slid a key across the counter and pointed toward a narrow hallway. The room was simple with a single bed, a small dresser, and a lamp that cast a warm circle of light across the carpet. I sat down on the edge of the bed and finally allowed the silence of the day to settle around me. The clock beside the lamp read 11:15. Somewhere in the distance a truck engine rumbled along the highway. I placed the empty coffee cup in the trash and rested my hands in my lap. After 72 years of life I had learned that sometimes the most important moments are the quiet ones when the world pauses long enough for you to see things clearly. And that night as I sat alone in that small motel room I began to understand that the story Brittany believed she had ended might only be beginning. I woke up the next morning to the faint sound of a truck shifting gears somewhere along the highway, and for a few seconds I did not remember where I was. The ceiling above me was unfamiliar, painted a pale color that had probably been white many years ago, and the small lamp beside the bed cast a soft yellow glow across the room. Then the memories of the previous night returned quietly, one detail at a time, like pieces of paper drifting back onto a desk after a gust of wind. The kitchen table. Brittany's calm voice. The $8 resting in my hand. I sat up slowly and placed my feet on the carpet, feeling the stiffness in my knees that always greeted me in the morning. The room was silent except for the distant sound of traffic, and for a moment I simply sat there and breathed, letting the reality of the situation settle into something steady and manageable. At my age you learn that panic rarely improves anything. Instead you begin by observing what is in front of you. The small clock beside the lamp read 7:42 in the morning. A thin line of sunlight slipped through the curtains and stretched across the floor. My coat was folded neatly over the back of the chair where I had placed it the night before, and inside the pocket were the 3 remaining dollar bills that represented everything I possessed at that moment. I stood up, washed my face in the small bathroom sink, and looked at my reflection in the mirror. My silver hair was slightly disordered from sleep and there were deeper lines around my eyes than I remembered from a few years ago, but the woman looking back at me still appeared calm. George used to say that calmness was the most powerful form of dignity a person could carry. I thought about him often that morning. George Whitmore had been the kind of man who planned ahead in quiet ways that people did not always notice. During the 38 years of our marriage he handled many things behind the scenes, from repairing the porch railing to organizing tax documents in neat folders inside the study. I remembered one particular afternoon about a year before his health began to decline. We had been sitting in the living room while a late summer rain tapped gently against the windows. George was reviewing some papers at his desk when he suddenly looked up and said something that at the time seemed almost casual. He said that if anything ever happened to him, I should make sure to speak with a man named Mark Dalton. I remember asking him who Mark Dalton was, and George explained that he was an attorney who had helped him organize several financial matters related to the business he once owned. I had nodded politely and then returned to reading my book, assuming it was one of those routine details husbands sometimes mention without expecting their wives to remember every word. That memory drifted through my mind now as I finished washing my hands and stepped back into the small motel room. There was a stillness in the air that encouraged reflection. I sat on the edge of the bed and repeated the name quietly to myself. Mark Dalton. For a moment I wondered why that particular memory had surfaced so clearly after so many months. Perhaps it was simply because when your life changes unexpectedly the mind begins searching through old conversations for clues that might suddenly matter. I put on my coat and stepped outside into the crisp morning air. The Riverside Lodge looked different in daylight. The blue paint on the railings appeared more faded than I noticed the night before and the gravel parking lot glistened slightly with morning dew. A few pickup trucks were parked near the far end of the building, likely belonging to travelers who had stayed overnight. The woman who had helped me the evening before stood near the office door holding a cup of coffee. She greeted me warmly and asked if I had slept well. I thanked her again for her kindness and assured her that I had rested enough to continue my day. She nodded with the quiet understanding of someone who had probably seen many travelers pass through that small motel carrying stories they did not always explain. I began walking slowly toward the road, thinking about what steps might come next. The town was already waking up around me. A delivery van passed by carrying boxes to the grocery store, and a group of construction workers gathered at a nearby diner across the street. Their laughter drifted through the morning air in brief bursts. Life was continuing as it always had, indifferent to the fact that I had lost my place in it the night before. As I approached the intersection, I noticed a public bench beside a small bus stop sign. I sat down for a moment and allowed myself to think more carefully about the name George had mentioned. Mark Dalton. If George had wanted me to remember that name, there must have been a reason. My husband had never been careless with words. He believed that important things should be explained clearly and remembered properly. I closed my eyes for a moment and tried to picture his office desk again, the neat rows of folders and the calm focus he carried whenever he worked on something he considered important. A gentle realization began forming in my mind, not dramatic or sudden but steady like the slow turning of a key in a lock. Perhaps the story Brittany believed had ended with $8 on a kitchen table had another chapter that had not yet been opened. I stood up from the bench and looked toward the main street where a row of businesses had already begun opening their doors for the day. Somewhere in that town there would be a phone directory or a public computer where I could search for the name Mark Dalton. I placed my hands inside my coat pockets and began walking toward the center of town, feeling for the first time since the previous night that the path ahead of me might contain more possibilities than Brittany had imagined when she told me to stop being so dramatic. I walked toward the center of town with the name Mark Dalton repeating quietly in my mind like a small bell that refused to stop ringing. The morning had grown brighter and the streets were beginning to fill with the familiar sounds of a working day. Cars rolled slowly through intersections, a delivery truck backed into the alley behind the grocery store, and the smell of fresh bread drifted from a bakery on the corner. I had passed these same streets hundreds of times over the years, yet that morning everything looked slightly different, as if the town had shifted just enough to reveal details I had never noticed before. When a person suddenly finds themselves outside the life they once lived, even ordinary places begin to feel like unfamiliar territory. I reached the small public library on Jefferson Street just after 8:30. The building was modest but welcoming with tall windows that allowed the sunlight to spread across the wooden floors inside. I stepped through the front doors and paused for a moment to warm my hands near the entrance as the cool air followed me in from outside. The quiet of the library wrapped around me like a calm blanket. A woman behind the front desk greeted me politely and asked if I needed help finding anything. I explained that I was looking for information about a local attorney named Mark Dalton. She nodded and pointed me toward a row of public computers near the back wall. I had not used a computer very often in recent years, but the process turned out to be simpler than I expected. Within a few minutes I found a listing for Dalton and Pierce Legal Services located only 4 blocks away on Walnut Avenue. The name stirred another memory from long ago. George had once mentioned that the firm specialized in estate planning and financial structures for family-owned businesses. I thanked the librarian and stepped back outside into the sunlight, feeling a quiet sense of direction returning to my thoughts. Walnut Avenue was a pleasant street lined with older brick buildings and neatly trimmed maple trees that cast patterned shadows across the sidewalks. As I approached the address listed on the computer screen, I noticed a polished brass sign beside the entrance that read Dalton and Pierce Attorneys at Law. The door was unlocked and a small bell chimed softly as I stepped inside. The reception area was calm and orderly with framed certificates hanging on the walls and a tall bookshelf filled with neatly arranged binders. A receptionist looked up from her desk and greeted me with a warm but professional smile. I told her my name was Eleanor Whitmore and asked if Mark Dalton might be available for a brief conversation. She studied a schedule on her computer and then asked if my husband had once worked with their office. When I told her that George Whitmore had been a client several years earlier, she nodded with recognition. She explained that Mr. Dalton was in the building and would likely be willing to see me. After a short wait, she guided me down a quiet hallway to a corner office where a tall man with silver hair stood up from behind his desk as I entered. He looked at me carefully for a moment before his expression softened with recognition. He said that he remembered George very well and that my husband had been one of the most thoughtful clients he had ever worked with. Hearing George's name spoken in that calm, respectful tone brought an unexpected warmth to my chest. I sat down across from the desk and explained that George had once told me to contact him if anything important ever happened. Mr. Dalton listened quietly without interrupting while I described the events of the previous evening in simple factual terms. I did not add dramatic details and I did not speak with anger. I simply explained that I had left the house on Maple Ridge Drive with very little money and no clear plan for what would come next. When I finished speaking, he folded his hands together and looked at me with the thoughtful expression of someone reviewing a complex puzzle. After a moment he stood up and walked toward a large cabinet along the wall where dozens of labeled folders were arranged in alphabetical order. He pulled out one marked Whitmore George and placed it gently on the desk. Inside were several documents neatly organized in protective sleeves. As he turned the pages, he explained that George had established a detailed legal structure several years earlier related to the assets he had accumulated from the sale of his construction business. According to Mr. Dalton, the arrangement had been designed to ensure long-term security for the family while also protecting certain decisions under my direct authority. I listened carefully while he described how the documents worked together like parts of a carefully constructed blueprint. Some sections referred to financial accounts held in trust while others outlined ownership rights connected to the house and several investments that George had quietly maintained over the years. The more Mr. Dalton explained, the clearer it became that George had anticipated situations where misunderstandings or pressure from others might complicate decisions after his passing. By the time he finished speaking, the sunlight through the office window had shifted across the floor and settled near the corner of the desk. Mr. Dalton closed the folder and looked at me with a calm seriousness that felt almost reassuring. He explained that before any decisions were made we would need to review several details together and confirm the current status of the assets George had placed under the legal structure. He also assured me that nothing I described from the previous night automatically removed my authority over those arrangements. I thanked him quietly and sat for a moment absorbing everything he had just explained. The world outside the office window continued moving as it always had, with pedestrians passing along Walnut Avenue and cars stopping patiently at the traffic light. Yet inside that quiet room a realization was forming that changed the shape of the story I believed had ended on a kitchen table the night before. George Whitmore had never been careless about protecting the people he loved, and as I listened to Mark Dalton calmly outline the documents inside that folder, I began to understand that the $8 Brittany placed in my hand might not represent the end of my place in this family after all. I remained seated in the chair across from Mark Dalton's desk while he carefully reopened the folder that held my husband's documents. The room was quiet except for the faint sound of traffic outside the window and the soft rustle of paper as he turned each page. For many years I had known George as a thoughtful man who believed in planning for the future, but at that moment I began to realize just how deeply he had considered the possibility that life might not always unfold the way people expected. Mark Dalton explained that several years earlier, shortly after George sold his construction company, he had created a legal trust designed to protect the family's assets and to ensure that the authority over those assets remained with a person he trusted completely. That person, Mr. Dalton explained calmly, was me. The words settled into the air slowly, almost gently, and for a moment I simply looked at him to make sure I had understood correctly. He nodded and continued explaining the structure George had established. According to the documents inside the folder, the house on Maple Ridge Drive was not owned directly by Jason or Brittany or even by George himself at the time of his passing. Instead, it was held inside the Whitmore Family Trust, an arrangement designed specifically to prevent impulsive decisions or outside pressure from interfering with the long-term stability of the property. The trust had a single active controller. My name was written clearly beside that designation. Mr. Dalton turned another page and showed me additional information that George had organized with remarkable care. There were financial accounts connected to the trust that contained funds from the sale of the business, several conservative investments that had grown quietly over the past decade, and a reserve account that George had instructed the firm to maintain for future living expenses. As Mr. Dalton described each section of the documents, his voice remained calm and professional, but I could sense a quiet respect in the way he spoke about George's foresight. My husband, it seemed, had not simply left behind a collection of belongings. He had left behind a carefully built structure meant to protect the family even when circumstances became complicated. I leaned back slightly in the chair and allowed the information to settle into my thoughts. The kitchen conversation from the previous evening replayed briefly in my mind. Brittany standing beside the counter with her polite smile. Jason avoiding my eyes. $8 resting on the table as if that small amount of money represented the value of my place in their lives. The contrast between that moment and the documents in front of me felt almost surreal. Mr. Dalton closed the folder again and rested his hands calmly on the desk. He explained that while the trust allowed Jason to live in the house as a family member, it did not grant him ownership or decision-making authority over the property. Any major decisions regarding the house or the financial accounts required approval from the trust controller. That controller was still me. The explanation was not dramatic or emotional. It was simply a matter of legal fact written clearly in the documents George had signed years earlier. I asked Mr. Dalton whether Jason might already know about the trust. He considered the question carefully before answering. He said that George had mentioned the arrangement briefly when the documents were first finalized, but it was possible that the details had not been fully understood at the time. Estate structures can be complex, and people sometimes remember only the parts that seem convenient in the moment. I nodded quietly. Over the years I had noticed that Brittany preferred quick decisions and simple explanations. The idea that the house might actually belong to a legal trust under my authority was not something she would likely have considered when she placed $8 in my hand and suggested that I find a motel. Mr. Dalton asked gently where I had stayed the previous night. I told him about the Riverside Lodge and the kindness of the woman at the front desk who had allowed me to rest there. He listened without interrupting and then said something that stayed with me long after the meeting ended. He said that sometimes the most important legal documents are written not because someone expects trouble, but because they understand how quickly circumstances can change when grief and misunderstanding enter a family. George, it seemed, had understood that possibility better than most people. The conversation continued for another hour while we reviewed several details related to the trust accounts and the current status of the house. Mr. Dalton assured me that there was no immediate need to rush into any decisions. The legal structure George created remained active and secure. However, he also explained that as the trust controller I had the authority to determine how the property and funds would be used moving forward. That authority included the ability to review who lived in the house and under what conditions. When the meeting finally ended, I stepped outside onto Walnut Avenue again and paused near the curb while the afternoon sun warmed the sidewalk. The town looked the same as it had earlier that morning. People walked past the bakery carrying small paper bags, a cyclist waited at the traffic light, and somewhere nearby a dog barked cheerfully behind a fence. Life was continuing exactly as it always had. Yet something inside my understanding had shifted. The story Brittany believed had ended with $8 and a closed front door now contained information she had never considered. I placed my hands gently in the pockets of my coat and began walking down the street with a quiet awareness that George Whitmore had not left me unprepared for the future. In fact, the future might be far more interesting than anyone standing in that kitchen the night before had imagined. When I left Walnut Avenue that afternoon, the air felt warmer than it had earlier, but the warmth had little to do with the weather. It came from a quiet realization settling into place inside my mind. For the first time since Brittany placed those $8 in my hand, I no longer felt like a woman who had been pushed out of her own life. Instead, I felt like someone who had simply stepped outside the house for a moment while the real story waited patiently for me to return. I walked slowly through the town square, passing the same bakery and diner I had seen earlier that morning, but this time I was not searching for direction. I was thinking carefully about what George had built and what it meant now that I understood it. George Whitmore had never enjoyed dramatic gestures. He believed in steady preparation, the kind that happened quietly over years rather than all at once. The trust he created was exactly that kind of preparation. It was not revenge. It was not punishment. It was simply protection. And now that protection belonged to me. I reached the small park near Jefferson Street and sat down on a wooden bench beneath a tall oak tree. The leaves above me moved gently in the breeze and a group of children played near the far end of the grass while their parents watched from folding chairs. The ordinary rhythm of the afternoon reminded me that the world rarely pauses for anyone's personal crisis. Life continues whether you are ready or not. I placed my hands together in my lap and began thinking about the next steps carefully. Mr. Dalton had explained the legal structure in clear terms. The house on Maple Ridge Drive belonged to the Whitmore Family Trust. I was the active controller of that trust. Jason and Brittany were living there only because the trust allowed family members to occupy the property under my authority. Without that authority, the situation changed completely. The thought was not satisfying in a cruel way. Instead it felt balanced, almost like discovering that a scale which had tipped too far in one direction was finally settling back to the center. I remained on that bench for nearly half an hour reviewing every detail Mr. Dalton had shared. The trust accounts. The investment funds. The ownership rights connected to the property. George had created a system that moved quietly beneath the surface of our lives for years. Brittany likely believed the house belonged to Jason now that George was gone. Jason himself might have believed the same thing. But belief and legal reality were two very different things. Eventually I stood up and walked toward the small coffee shop across the street. The smell of roasted beans filled the air when I stepped inside, and I used one of the public phones near the entrance to call Mr. Dalton's office again. The receptionist recognized my name and transferred the call immediately. When Mr. Dalton answered, I explained that I had spent some time thinking about the trust and wanted to ask a few practical questions about what steps could be taken if the living arrangements at the house needed to be reviewed. His voice remained calm and professional as he explained the options available. As the trust controller, I had the authority to request a formal property review, which would legally clarify who had permission to occupy the house. If necessary, the firm could also notify financial institutions connected to the trust to ensure that all accounts were operating under the correct oversight. None of this required confrontation or raised voices. It was simply a matter of documentation and proper procedure. I thanked him and ended the call feeling more composed than I had at any point since the previous evening. After ordering a cup of coffee, I sat by the window and watched the afternoon sunlight move slowly across the street. The conversation in the kitchen replayed once more in my memory. Brittany's polite smile. Jason standing quietly behind her. $8 placed on the table as if that small amount represented the end of my place in the family. At the time it had felt like a closing door. Now it looked more like the beginning of a misunderstanding they had not yet discovered. I finished the coffee and stepped outside again. The afternoon had begun to soften into early evening, and long shadows stretched across the sidewalks as people finished their workday and headed home. I started walking back toward Riverside Lodge where my small room waited. The gravel beneath my shoes made a gentle sound as I crossed the parking lot and unlocked the door. The room looked exactly as it had that morning. A simple bed, a small dresser, and a lamp casting a circle of warm light. I sat down at the small table near the window and placed my hands calmly on the surface. Somewhere across town, Jason and Brittany were likely moving through the house on Maple Ridge Drive as if nothing had changed. Brittany might have been planning dinner. Jason might have been watching television in the living room where George once read the newspaper each afternoon. They believed the house was theirs now. They believed the conversation from the night before had settled everything. But the quiet truth resting inside the documents on Mr. Dalton's desk suggested something very different. I turned off the lamp and looked out the window at the darkening sky above the highway. For the first time since leaving that kitchen, I felt no urgency to prove anything or argue with anyone. The path forward did not require anger. It only required patience and the careful use of the authority George had trusted me to carry. And patience, after 72 years of life, was something I understood very well. The next morning arrived quietly, with a pale gray light spreading across the curtains of the small room at Riverside Lodge. I woke before the alarm on the bedside clock even had a chance to ring, not because I had slept poorly, but because my mind had already begun arranging the day ahead in careful order. For the first time since the night Brittany placed $8 in my hand, I no longer felt uncertain about what would happen next. The situation had moved beyond emotions and into something far calmer and more precise. It had moved into structure. I sat up slowly and looked around the room. The same modest furniture stood exactly where it had been the night before. The same quiet hum from the highway drifted through the window. Yet the atmosphere felt different. When a person finally understands the shape of their own position, the world begins to feel less unpredictable. I washed my face, straightened my coat, and left the room just after 8 in the morning. The woman at the front desk greeted me with the same gentle kindness she had shown the previous night. I thanked her again before stepping outside into the crisp morning air. The sky was bright and clear, and the streets were already alive with the movement of commuters and delivery trucks. I walked toward the coffee shop on the corner where I had made the phone call the day before. Inside, the smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the room. I ordered a simple cup and sat near the window where I could watch the street while organizing my thoughts. My plan was simple. Not dramatic. Not emotional. Just careful. After finishing the coffee, I walked back toward Walnut Avenue and entered the office building where Mark Dalton worked. The receptionist greeted me with a small smile and told me that Mr. Dalton had already begun preparing the documents we discussed the previous day. When I entered his office, he gestured toward a chair and slid several neatly printed pages across the desk. He explained that these documents would initiate a formal administrative review of the Whitmore family trust properties and accounts. The process was routine for situations where the trust controller needed to confirm the proper management of assets. Nothing about it was hostile or aggressive. It was simply a confirmation of authority. I read through each page slowly and carefully. George had always believed that documents deserved full attention before being signed. When I finished reviewing them, I placed my signature where Mr. Dalton indicated. The ink dried quickly under the afternoon light coming through the office window. With those signatures, the process quietly began moving forward. Mr. Dalton explained that several notifications would be sent that afternoon. Financial institutions connected to the trust would confirm account oversight. Property records associated with Maple Ridge Drive would be reviewed to ensure the correct legal authority was recognized. And most importantly, the occupants of the property would receive a formal notice reminding them that the house remained under the governance of the Whitmore Family Trust. I thanked him and left the office feeling the same calm steadiness that had followed me since the previous afternoon. Outside, Walnut Avenue continued its usual rhythm. A delivery driver unloaded boxes at the bakery. A group of college students crossed the street laughing. No one around me had any idea that a quiet legal process had just begun that would eventually change the assumptions Brittany and Jason had been living under. I spent the rest of the afternoon walking through the familiar parts of town where George and I had spent so many ordinary days together. I passed the hardware store where he once spent an entire Saturday choosing the perfect nails for repairing the porch railing. I passed the small park where Jason learned to ride his bicycle when he was 6 years old. Memory has a strange way of turning ordinary places into reminders of the life you once built piece by piece. By early evening I returned to Riverside Lodge and sat by the small window of the room while the sun disappeared behind the highway trees. The quiet allowed my thoughts to settle again. Somewhere across town, Brittany and Jason were likely continuing their normal routine. They probably believed the situation from the previous night had resolved itself. Perhaps Brittany had already explained to friends that I had chosen to leave after becoming emotional. Stories often grow more convenient when the people telling them are certain no one will challenge the version they prefer. I turned on the small television for background noise while organizing my coat on the chair beside the bed. The clock moved slowly toward 8 o'clock. That was when my phone vibrated on the table. I looked down and saw Jason's name on the screen. For a moment I simply watched it ring. The timing was almost interesting. The notices Mr. Dalton described would have begun reaching the appropriate offices only a few hours earlier. I answered the call calmly. Jason's voice sounded unsettled in a way I had not heard since he was a teenager facing consequences he had not expected. He asked where I was staying and whether everything was all right. I told him I was safe and comfortable. There was a pause before he spoke again. His next words were slower and more cautious. He said that someone from a financial office had contacted him earlier asking questions about the Whitmore Family Trust. I listened quietly without interrupting. Then he mentioned that a letter had been delivered to the house that afternoon addressed to the current occupants of the property on Maple Ridge Drive. His voice carried confusion more than anger. He said the letter explained that the property was under review by the trust controller. Another brief silence followed before he asked a question that seemed to arrive with genuine uncertainty. He asked whether I knew anything about that notice. I leaned back slightly in the chair beside the small table and looked out the window at the distant headlights moving along the highway. My answer was calm and simple. Yes, I told him. I knew exactly about it. I held the phone quietly after answering Jason's question, listening to the silence on the other end of the line as he tried to process my calm response. For several seconds he did not speak. The only sound I could hear was the faint hum of traffic passing along the highway outside the motel window. Finally he cleared his throat and asked what exactly was going on. His voice was careful now, the same cautious tone people use when they realize they might have misunderstood something important. I told him there was nothing complicated about it. The Whitmore Family Trust had simply begun a standard review of the property and accounts connected to it. My words were steady and polite, the way George always preferred difficult conversations to be handled. Jason exhaled slowly before asking another question. He said Brittany had opened the letter earlier that afternoon and that neither of them understood why the house was being reviewed. He said the document mentioned the authority of the trust controller and asked whether I knew who that person was. I looked out the window again at the distant headlights moving along the highway and answered him with the same quiet tone I had used all evening. I told him the trust controller was me. The silence that followed was longer this time. Jason had always been a thoughtful child, but he had also inherited his father's tendency to pause when absorbing unexpected information. When he finally spoke again, his voice sounded different. Not angry. Just uncertain. He said Brittany believed the house belonged to him now that George had passed away. I explained gently that the house had been placed inside the Whitmore Family Trust several years earlier and that the trust still governed how the property could be used. Jason said Brittany had never mentioned anything about a trust. I told him that sometimes people remember only the details that seem convenient at the time. The conversation continued carefully, almost cautiously, as if we were both walking across a bridge that had only just appeared in front of us. Jason asked if the review meant they had to leave the house immediately. I told him the process was simply a confirmation of how the property was being managed and who had permission to live there. Nothing dramatic was happening. It was only a matter of making sure the trust was functioning exactly as George had designed it. Another long pause followed. Then Jason said Brittany was standing beside him and wanted to speak with me. When her voice came through the phone a moment later, it carried the same polite brightness she had used in the kitchen the night before, but now there was a sharp edge beneath it. She asked why I was causing so much trouble instead of simply coming back to the house and discussing things like a normal family. I listened quietly until she finished speaking. Then I reminded her of the conversation from the previous evening when she placed $8 in my hand and suggested I find a motel. I said that I had followed her suggestion exactly. I had found a place to stay. And while I was there, I had taken the opportunity to review the legal structure George created to protect the family property. Brittany tried to laugh it off at first. She said I was misunderstanding the situation and that Jason was the rightful owner of the house now. Her confidence sounded rehearsed, the way people sometimes speak when they assume the facts will eventually align with what they want to be true. I explained calmly that the documents Mr. Dalton reviewed earlier that day showed a different arrangement. The house belonged to the Whitmore Family Trust. And the trust controller responsible for overseeing the property was still Eleanor Whitmore. There was no anger in my voice when I said it. Only clarity. Brittany stopped laughing after that. I could hear her whispering something to Jason while the phone shifted between them. A moment later Jason returned to the line and asked if we could meet in person to talk about everything. I told him that would be reasonable. Mr. Dalton had already suggested that a family discussion might help clarify the situation once the review process was underway. Jason asked when the meeting could happen. I told him that Mr. Dalton's office would contact him the next morning with a proposed time. The trust required that all discussions about the property take place with proper documentation present. Jason agreed quietly. Before ending the call, he asked whether I was comfortable where I was staying. I assured him that the Riverside Lodge had been very kind and that I had everything I needed for the moment. When the call ended, I set the phone down on the small table and turned off the television that had been playing quietly in the background. The room returned to silence again. Outside the window, the night traffic moved steadily along the highway, headlights appearing and disappearing like small moving stars. Somewhere across town, Brittany and Jason were likely standing in the kitchen where the conversation had begun the night before. Perhaps the $8 were still sitting on the table where Brittany placed them. The difference now was that the quiet legal structure George had created years earlier had finally stepped into the light. I turned off the lamp beside the bed and lay down, listening to the gentle sounds of the night outside. The situation no longer felt uncertain. Tomorrow the meeting with Mr. Dalton would begin the next part of the story, and for the first time since that kitchen door closed behind me I knew that the truth waiting inside those documents was something Brittany had never expected to face. I arrived at Mark Dalton's office the next morning just after 9 o'clock, and the calm rhythm of Walnut Avenue felt very different from the tension I knew was building inside the conference room upstairs. The receptionist greeted me with the same quiet professionalism as before and guided me toward a long wooden table where several folders were already arranged in careful order. Mark Dalton stood near the window reviewing a document when I entered, and he gave a small nod that carried both reassurance and respect. A few minutes later the door opened again and Jason walked in first, followed closely by Brittany. Jason looked tired, as if the previous night had not offered him much sleep. Brittany, on the other hand, carried herself with the same controlled confidence she always preferred to show in public, though I noticed the way her eyes moved quickly across the documents on the table before she even sat down. Mark Dalton invited everyone to take a seat and began the meeting in the same calm tone he had used when explaining the trust to me the day before. He said the purpose of the conversation was simple. The Whitmore Family Trust required that all individuals living in the property on Maple Ridge Drive understand the legal structure governing the home and the responsibilities attached to it. He opened the folder and carefully placed several documents in front of Jason and Brittany so they could read the headings for themselves. Jason leaned forward quietly while Brittany crossed her arms and studied the papers with narrowed eyes. The room remained silent for nearly a minute as they looked through the first few pages. Eventually Jason looked up and asked the same question he had asked me on the phone the previous evening. He asked whether the house truly belonged to the trust rather than to him personally. Mark Dalton answered without hesitation. Yes, the house was legally owned by the Whitmore Family Trust, which had been created by George Whitmore several years earlier. The trust had a designated controller responsible for overseeing all decisions regarding the property. That controller, he explained clearly, was Eleanor Whitmore. Brittany shifted slightly in her chair when she heard my name. Her earlier confidence seemed to pause for the first time since she entered the room. She asked whether the trust could be changed now that George was gone. Mark Dalton explained that the structure George established had been designed specifically to remain stable after his passing. The controller of the trust had authority to review living arrangements, financial decisions, and property use. However, the structure itself was intentionally difficult to alter without the controller's approval. Brittany opened her mouth as if she wanted to challenge the explanation, but the documents in front of her offered little room for interpretation. Jason remained quiet, reading through each page slowly. After several minutes he leaned back in his chair and looked toward me with an expression that was no longer defensive. It looked thoughtful instead. He asked why George would have arranged things this way without explaining it more clearly to the family. I answered him calmly. George believed that financial stability should be protected carefully, especially during moments when emotions might influence decisions too quickly. The trust was not meant to create conflict. It was meant to prevent it. Brittany spoke again then, though her voice sounded less certain than before. She said the situation had been misunderstood and that no one had intended to push me out of the house permanently. She said the conversation in the kitchen had simply become emotional. I listened quietly before responding. I reminded her that the suggestion to leave had been very clear, and the $8 placed on the table had made the message even clearer. I reached into my coat pocket and placed the same folded bills on the table between us. They had remained untouched since the night before. For a moment no one spoke. The small stack of bills rested on the polished wood like a quiet reminder of how quickly assumptions can change. Jason looked down at them and then back toward me. His expression carried something new now, something closer to understanding than confusion. Mark Dalton cleared his throat gently and continued the discussion in a professional tone. He explained that the trust did not require immediate changes to the living arrangements unless the controller believed they were necessary. However, the meeting provided an opportunity to clarify expectations moving forward. The house on Maple Ridge Drive remained part of the trust. Anyone living there did so under the authority of the trust controller. Jason nodded slowly as he absorbed the information. Brittany said nothing further. When the meeting finally ended, Mark Dalton gathered the documents and thanked everyone for attending. Jason paused near the door before leaving and looked back toward me with a quiet seriousness. He said he had not understood the situation clearly before and that he wanted to talk again later when things were calmer. I told him we would have time for that conversation in the future. Brittany walked out without speaking. When the door closed behind them, the room grew quiet again. Mark Dalton organized the remaining papers and offered me a small smile that carried both approval and patience. Outside the window, the town continued moving through another ordinary morning. Cars stopped at the intersection. Pedestrians crossed the street. The world had not changed dramatically in a single moment. But one important misunderstanding had finally been corrected. I picked up the $8 from the table and folded them carefully back into my coat pocket before standing to leave. The story that began with those $8 on a kitchen table had reached a point where everyone involved finally understood their true value.